Okay, welcome folks. Here we are again. I'm down in Canberra, coming to you all the way from the nation's capital with another rousing edition of Ask Mark Anything. Okay, today's question is one that I'm hearing quite often from a number of salespeople when they're talking about whether or not they have what we refer to as it. When you hear that it factor, I don't know about you, but years ago when they said of a salesman or a sales lady that they had the it factor, I was quite, lured by this, because those that had it had what I refer to as abundance. They had lots of sales, lots of clients, lots of listings, and that all-important thing, lots of prosperity and all of the trimmings that we aspire to get as real estate agents. So the question today, the one that I'm looking to answer, is exactly what is it? Now, you might be surprised to learn that I kind of figured it out. You see, for years I've studied the art of selling, sales books, read them, I've been to sales seminars, and I've worked hand in hand to discuss the art of selling with a number of people that have had a prolific existence in the world of sales. And I've pondered this question for a long time, because when I heard about this it factor, whenever I heard about this it factor, I wanted to have that it as well. And what I discovered was that the it factor was a common denominator that was specific to salespeople that were at the top of their game. It's an abundance thing. It basically means that you have abundance. So when I read these sales books over the years, the premise of every sales book that I've ever read is that if you create a logical argument as to why somebody should do something, well, they will basically do it. The problem, however, in the game that we're in, that business of real estate sales, is that the people that we're dealing with aren't always thinking logically. In fact, in the majority of cases, they're under what I would refer to as emotional duress. Now, this emotional duress causes them to be in a state where they're not necessarily, wouldn't say that they're not prepared, but they don't necessarily hear the logical argument, so they're making decisions based out of that emotional duress, and always the best decision to make when things get a bit tough is to just disagree and not run with it. But when you look at people that are in a state of emotional duress, whose advice do they usually heed? Whose advice do they usually follow? And that's usually a person who, from their perspective at least, is sympathetic to their plight. What they always look for is a person who gets the experience that they're going through, that emotional duress. So if it was relationships, if it's somebody that's been a bust up or something like that, because they say those situations where you're under emotional duress are either a marital state, when you're getting married, a divorce, a death in the family, or otherwise, this is when our sense of logic leaves us and we're stressing. So for our business, we're dealing with the business of people moving houses. They're under that emotional duress, and sometimes those motives are associated with financial duress, sometimes divorce or otherwise. But if you've got a couple that's getting divorced, friends, and they say they're under a situation where they're going through a separation or otherwise, and they're experiencing this emotional duress, the first thing they look for is somebody who's been through a similar situation. When they hear that person has been through a divorce or been through a separation, they kind of lock on, they go, hey, you get me, and then they'll listen to the advice of that person of how to handle that situation properly. Now, this transpires across to the game of selling. You see, what the sellers are looking for when they're in a state of emotional duress and they're not prepared to listen to those logical arguments is somebody who understands their plight, and fundamentally they're looking for a little bit of sympathy. Now, the problem with sympathy, if we as salespeople sympathise with our sellers around this, we too are experiencing an emotion, and then you as a salesperson, given that you are emotional yourself and experiencing that sympathetic disposition for the clients, your sense of logic might well leave you too. So now, as I say, we have two idiots driving the car and a real problem afoot. So how do we overcome this? Well, the answer is to stay well clear of sympathy and instead demonstrate empathy. You see, empathy is not an emotion. Empathy, in fact, is a disposition. It's a disposition of putting yourself in the other person's shoes to understand how they're feeling. Now, the encouraging part is when you demonstrate empathy to somebody who is under emotional duress, they pick this up, of course, as sympathy. So when you demonstrate this empathy and they get that feeling that you do in fact understand them, suddenly the connection is made. Suddenly that person gets or feels that you get them, you understand their plight, and suddenly they begin to listen to your advice. And once they begin to listen to your advice, this is when the magic happens. They will then, or you can then, steadfastly begin to present the logical reasons as to why they should heed your advice and do as you ask, and then immediately you now have that connection and you have control. That client is listening to you. So this is the difference in the world of selling real estate. The whole thing transpires, that very same it factor transpires when you're working with buyers. If, when that buyer is feeling emotive, when they find the property that they like, they go a little bit lightheaded, yeah? If you're clever and you make that connection by empathetically understanding where they sit, you can then maneuver the price up. And the way that I explain this in negotiation is I say that what a great salesperson does is they get a buyer, once they find them the property they like, they see that that person has made a connection with the home emotionally, that they feel like they want to live there, then a great salesperson immediately withdraws the property from them. What we do is we create a desire of gain when we see that they're falling for it, and then once you know that they're falling from it, you should pull it away from them and create that fear of loss. That fear of loss tends not to make them feel like they can't attain the property. Importantly, it helps them see value. You see, a buyer values that which they fight for. So this it factor does not just necessarily stick with your ability to communicate well with sellers, it transcends across to buyers. Once you've got it, once you get it, then you can start to use that it factor to get just about anything you want done in the world of persuasion. So as I say, at the end of the day, the it factor is the ability to empathise without sympathising. Now this might sound a bit harsh, it's certainly not derived around you being steadfast. Of course, in any situation you're always going to struggle with this because of course as a salesperson, the very thing that makes you a salesperson can often be the enemy in this explanation that I'm giving you. You see, the thing that makes you a salesperson is your ability to express yourself emotionally and to be in touch with your emotions, and importantly, not to be afraid to express them. But of course, this becomes for all of us a very difficult proposition in the world of selling, because if we're trying to keep in check that ability to sympathise, in other words, if we're trying to not sympathise in a plight and rather empathise, but the situation for the seller is quite dire, well then it becomes a difficult thing. But understand this, the moment you become sympathetic to a seller's disposition, you're in a bit of trouble yourself because your sense of logic leaves you, and this is when you hear your colleagues, your fellow salespeople, if they're talking about a property and they're saying, look, the owner can't accept that amount of money because they need a certain amount. Typically what it means is the salesperson has fallen into a state of sympathy rather than that empathetic disposition. So I hope this one clears it up for you. You've got to get that it factor on board. You've got to really work on the fact that you need to empathise without sympathising, because if you do sympathise, you're of no assistance to the seller, and certainly you're going to cause your sellers problems indirectly if you start becoming sympathetic with buyers. So what do I say? Well, get it, and you have then got it. You have got it, and you can move into the top echelon of real estate sales professionals nationally. So I hope that one clears it up for you, for those of you that have asked me. If you've got any other questions that you want to ask, we'll be back on board giving you all the information you need so that you can move forward as a real estate salesperson. So I hope that answers it for you. Another addition, and I'm glad to have allowed you to ask Mark, well, anything.